Hello everyone, my name is Morwenna and it's a huge delight to be with you all today. I'd like to start with a thank you to the organisers of the International Society for Music Education, Special Music Education and Music Therapy Commission Conference for having me with you as a keynote speaker. I'd also like to thank each and every one of you for tuning into my talk. Before I begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Aboriginal land. I live and work on the land of the Gadigal, who are one of the 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Gadigal are the traditional owners and the knowledge holders of the beautiful land that we now call Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and thank them for the continued custodianship of this land. In Australia, we live on unceded land, which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And in fact, there's a strong link between our First Nations people and disability, with nearly half of our First Nations people having disability or a long-term health condition, compared to 1 in 5 of us in the general Australian population. So we do have some work to do in terms of access to healthcare and the systemic and structural barriers for many people living in our First Nations communities. My name is Morwenna Collett and I'm an arts consultant specialising in diversity, access and inclusion. I've got a background as a classical musician and I'm a proud disabled person. I work with music, arts and cultural organisations to help them make improvements so that they can produce work with, by and for everyone in our communities, including people with disability. Disability became a part of my life in my first year of university. I was studying flute at the Queensland Conservatorium in Brisbane, and it was at that time that I experienced a range of sudden neurological symptoms which ended in a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Now that was 20 plus years ago now, and for me, those symptoms meant having to do things a little bit differently from the usual way that elite classical music operates. I had periods of losing some of the fine motor skills in my hands. I couldn't stand for long stretches of time, and playing in the evening became difficult due to pain and fatigue issues. Now, all of those things had solutions, such as playing in shorter periods of time, sitting instead of standing, or changing times of day of concerts. But it was hard to see how those hurdles could be overcome if I was planning a lifetime playing in traditional orchestral or soloist environments. These barriers were there because of the way things are done in classical music, and it was that inflexible nature of the industry at the time that made it difficult for me to imagine being able to carve out a viable, sustainable career as a performer. I couldn't see myself represented on stage, and there were no role models of other disabled musicians for me to look up to. Ultimately, this is what has led me to combine my lived experience of disability as an advocate and my professional interest in the arts and turn this into my career today. 20 years ago, as a young music student, I couldn't see a way for me to navigate the industry as a performer, and that's part of what's led me down the path of arts management. Through the work I do now, I'm helping to shape what the future of our industry looks like and try to remove some of that inflexibility. I want to rethink how we do things and get rid of the barriers so that other disabled people have more choices than I felt that I had when it comes to a career in music and the arts. This is my lived experience and also my professional experience, and I hope that the combination of these things today produce a useful discussion. Music is a universal language and something that is infused throughout the daily lives of almost everyone, providing a soundtrack to our lives and helping us just get through the day. Music unites us and it brings people together. Music is good for the soul, it's good for health and well-being, and I think it creates well-rounded human beings. In my mind, access to music is a basic human right and something that everyone needs to be included in. However, unfortunately, there are still many examples of exclusion in our music industry. Exclusion from physically inaccessible venues, exclusion from school music programs, or exclusion via a lack of accessible pathways into the profession, or exclusion from employment opportunities in our music workforce. A recent UK study showed that only 1.8% of the music industry workforce in the UK identified as disabled, with 73% of those surveyed feeling like the music industry has a reputation for long hours, which can actively discourage people who are disabled, who may need more flexibility in their work. Now, here in Australia, only 9% of our professional artist population identify as disabled, compared to 18% of our general population. So this shows that we do have some work to do to remove barriers and make sure our music industry is accessible and inclusive. I think that part of the problem is that there can be a bit of passing the buck or blame shifting for this exclusion across different levels or areas of the music sector. An orchestra might say that they've got no disabled musicians because there's none coming through the conservatorium or the university systems. And then a university might say that they don't have any disabled students because there's none coming through the school system. I don't think this is a particularly helpful way of thinking, as it's really just shifting the responsibility without proactively coming up with some of the solutions. So, what I want to talk to you about today is that each and every one of us has a role to play in helping to make the future of our music industry accessible and inclusive. No matter what your role or organisation you work for, you can help create broad cultural change and make sure that the next generation of disabled people are not excluded from the art form that we all know and love. This work needs to start at the most fundamental level. With our audience today being largely music educators and music therapists, many of you will have hugely influential roles with the people you're working with. Your belief in your students and patients can significantly impact not just their general health and well-being, but also what they believe is possible to achieve through music. In today's talk, I'm going to share some stories from different parts of the music ecosystem to give you some examples of some of the positive steps that individuals and organisations can take to help make real change. You as individuals are shaping the future of our industry, and you need to know what's possible. And so that's what I'm hoping to impart on you today. Now, before I get into the case studies with you, I think it's important to be clear on why we actually need to address any of this. Why should people with disability be included in music or in the arts? No doubt everyone tuning in today to this talk will agree that they do, but let's briefly unpack some of the reasons why this is important. A good place to start is with Article 30 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which talks about participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport. This recognises the rights of people with disability in taking part on an equal basis with others in cultural life. It also specifically addresses the need to enable people with disability to have the opportunity to develop and utilise their creative, artistic and intellectual potential, not only for their own benefit, but also for the enrichment of society. This is a really good reminder that we need to acknowledge people with disability as makers and creators of art, not just consumers or audience members. Arts organisations need to expect and plan not just for audience access, but for artist access as well. Now, another good argument for inclusion is to look at the prevalence of disabled people within arts and cultural communities. The Australia Council recently released its first public diversity report called Towards Equity. And this showed that artists with disability are vital contributors to Australia's arts and cultural sectors, but that a range of inequities and barriers exist in terms of arts attendance and also in employment. The report found that Australians living with disability are more likely than other Australians to be making art, but less likely to be making money from it. And that's not okay. So let's bust some myths and misconceptions by sharing some of that research with you. From this research, we can see People with disability attend just as much art as people without disability. And in fact, they are more likely to create art than people without disability. They're more likely to volunteer in the arts, and we're more likely to give money to the arts as well. But despite all of this involvement in the arts, unfortunately, we also know that artists with disability earn a whopping 42% less than their counterparts, which is a really big chasm that we must work on closing the gap with. 1/3 of artists with disability experience unemployment compared to only 1/4 of artists without disability. And we also know that underemployment is a huge issue as well. And while 18% of Australians identify as having disability, only 9% of our professional artists identify. So all of this shows that people with disability are absolutely interested in the arts as audience members, as supporters, as makers, but there's still a range of barriers that exist that need to be removed for us to have full and equal access to the arts. Unfortunately, in Australia, disability discrimination is still incredibly common, with 38% of complaints received by our Australian Human Rights Commission relating to disability. In fact, a much higher proportion than the complaints that relate to race, gender, or age discrimination. So there's more to do to make sure people with disability have equitable and dignified access to everyday things across many different facets of our society. So, what are all of these barriers that enable exclusion to happen? And how can we find solutions to remove those barriers? And where do these pop up in the context of music? When we think about what the word inclusion means and how we actually include people, we need to think about how we're removing barriers to make sure that people are included. I quite like this diagram, which shows us a roadmap from exclusion to segregation to integration to full inclusion. So you can see here that sometimes integrated means people are still in the main group, but they're still in a cluster and still separate from others within that main group. And true inclusion is where everyone is just all mixed in together. And when you think about this in the context of music, it makes me think of things like physically inaccessible venues, excluding people from entry. It makes me think of venues where there might be only one not so great seating area, which segregates all wheelchair users into one particular corner. It might be a workshop where all the disabled kids are bunched together to work in an integrated model. The ideal is that we design all of our music programs and all of our music activities with universal access in mind by designing things for everyone right from the start at the beginning of that design stage. Whether it's a venue or a workshop, there's going to be no need to retrofit or integrate access at the end because it's been considered right from the start. Now, in addition to this idea of universal design, which has been getting a lot of good discussion over recent years, in Australia at the moment, we're seeing a real rise across industries in talking about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, with key arts organisations such as the Sydney Opera House recently releasing a brand new diversity, inclusion, and belonging strategy. Now, Louise Heron, CEO of the Opera House, has described these 3 areas as being diversity, being invited to the party, inclusion, being invited to dance, and belonging is about feeling at home to choose the music. And I really like that analogy. For people with disability to be genuinely included, I think we also have to belong. And that's something that I hope we as music professionals can think about in terms of how we make this a reality in the programs that we work on. So, how can we as music professionals ensure that we work to remove these disabling barriers and provide pathways for people to engage with music and work in our industry, should they choose to? As I mentioned earlier, there's absolutely a role for all of us in this, no matter which part of the music ecosystem we work in. If we want to change the face of what the music industry looks like, we all need to jump in, roll up our sleeves and play our part in whatever area or level we're working in. So, I now want to share with you some stories from different parts of the music ecosystem to give you some examples of some of the positive steps that individuals and organisations can take to make a real difference. So, first up, let's talk about music educators. I'm sure that many of us fondly remember just how influential some of our own past music teachers have been on our careers and indeed on our relationship to music. I met the incredible musician Galen Lee when I was interviewing people for my Churchill Fellowship a couple of years ago. We spoke about all sorts of different things, but something that she really impressed upon me was the influence of her early music teacher and what a role that they had on shaping her life. They saw possibility and potential in her. As someone with a different physicality, she was lucky to have found a music teacher who was open to exploring different possibilities for how a violin could be held, and not someone who conformed to the usual way of doing things. Together, they came up with a way for Galen to play the violin like a cello and holding her bow like a bass player, and that worked really well. Music teachers need to see someone's potential, and Galen's teacher focused on a technique and translated it to her. That openness she experienced through that early relationship helped her on her way for developing a love of music and the violin, and led her to being the amazing touring musician that she is today. Galen left me with a great quote, which I really like, which is that great teachers focus on how the learner wants to learn, not on how the teacher wants to teach. Next up, I want to talk about training institutions. Also on my Churchill travels, I had an opportunity to visit the Royal Conservatoire in Scotland. They've really spent some time considering the barriers that disabled people can experience to the arts and to education, and how some of these barriers can be resolved. For several years now, they've been building and delivering a deaf theatre course taught using British Sign Language and English, which attracts deaf actors from around the world. They recognise different life experiences that people come with, and they know that educationally, the experiences have been really different, and that some people have been failed by not having education in their first language, such as sign language. Now, while this course isn't specifically in music, it has had a major impact on the culture and the attitudes towards disability across the rest of the conservatoire, including the music area. The head of this BSL program, Claire Lamont, says that there's been a massive shift in terms of learning and the type of theatre work produced over these last 5 or so years. She explains that when all of their students graduate now, they're going out into the industry with a better understanding of diversity and inclusion than they would have had otherwise. This organisational attitudinal shift has seen them attract higher numbers of disabled students across their institution more broadly, and this is now actually higher than the percentage of the population, with people feeling more comfortable to disclose and request the access accommodations that they need to succeed in their studies. The Royal Conservatoire also undertook a major curriculum reform, which shifted away from some of the more traditional ways of assessing. Adjustments include things like flexibility of time of day for people's recitals, the ability to sit instead of stand, no requirements to memorise, the opportunity to restart a recital if needed, and the ability to record lectures and have note takers for students who need this. The institution acknowledges the importance of considering access at every step of the student journey, removing barriers to student success, as well as keeping recordings, monitoring and reporting on their progress. I think this institution is a really interesting model in terms of disability inclusion for all of their students. Next, I want to give you an example of a professional music ensemble deeply considering and actioning disability inclusion. In 2017, the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra embarked on a journey to make their orchestra more accessible and inclusive, responding to the underrepresentation of disabled people in the arts workforce. The aim was to begin a process of transformation reaching far beyond just audiences. The BSO aspired to change the nature of the orchestral workforce, create exceptional music, and embrace creativity and inspiration that comes from working with a diverse range of people. This project was supported by an Arts Council England Changemaker grant, an initiative which was aimed at increasing diversity within senior leadership in the arts. Each participating organisation selected an individual from an underrepresented demographic group for a work placement and associated training. Unfortunately, the BSO was the only music organisation to apply for this program, not just in the disability area, but in any area of diversity, which does say something about the classical music industry in the UK 5 or so years ago. Now, with this project, there were 3 prongs. The first was a training placement for James Rose, who's a young disabled conductor, and this was about accelerating his development, experience, and confidence as an artist by providing him with the opportunity to curate, manage, and direct a new ensemble. The second was the creation of the BSO Resound, which is a disabled-led ensemble created and directed by James, giving a series of public performances and workshops. And the third prong was around BSO organisational change more broadly. It was around activities, including things like training for all staff to embed accessibility, inclusion, and disability awareness throughout the organisation. Now, with the appointment of the new CEO, Dougie Scarfy, at the time, the orchestra was ready for organisational change when the program commenced. There was complete buy-in across the organisation and strong support from senior management. From the start, it was clear that it wasn't just a learning and development team initiative, that inclusion is not a project of its own, and that being inclusive is actually needing to be at the heart and the soul of an organisation. The program has been disability-led since its inception. James actually applied to BSO to participate in the program and was then heavily involved in the program's design and the application to Arts Council England. BSO Resound members were recruited internationally to find the best players for the program. Quality was the highest value, as it was going to be part of the core output and needed to be the same quality as the general BSO ensemble. BSO Resound players also play with the full BSO ensemble at various different times. There are a number of challenges with this program to work through, of course. James is a wheelchair user, and of course there was no lift up to the BSO offices, so they had to think creatively how to manage any of the difficulties that came up. Now, the impact that this program has had on James, on BSO Resound ensemble musicians, BSO musicians more broadly, and staff generally has been significant. James says, to say that this has been life-changing is an understatement. I've moved from a place of you can't to I can, I will, and I have. For BSO, it has led to organisational-wide change and better diversity across their programs, audiences, workforce, and partnerships. BSO have done some great work documenting this project over multiple years, and it's attracted some great media attention, particularly in 2018 when James and BSO Resound performed with the BSO at the BBC Proms. Now, through this project, BSO have developed 5 principles of success for working inclusively. The first is that the social model of disability is central. The second is that everyone in the organisation needs to be involved. The third, that senior leadership and the trustees of the organisations need to drive the change. The fourth is that the highest artistic standards and quality are expected and then maintained. And the fifth is that opportunities for disabled people are created within every aspect of the organisation's work. There's quite a lot of information about this project on their website, and they've really committed to sharing their learnings from this experience. So do go and take a look. And now I'd like to just play you a short snippet of the Resound Ensemble so you can get a sense of their work.
We've all been told what success looks like, but what
has become the first professional orchestra in the world to form an ensemble of musicians with disabilities led by a disabled conductor. James Rose, who has cerebral palsy, uses a baton attached to his head as he doesn't have control of his arms.
Now, the musicians, who call themselves Resound, hope to prove that disabled people can and should be more involved in classical music. James Ingham has been to meet them at one of their first rehearsals.
Music, James says, ignites a ball of fire in his stomach. It is a passion he was always determined to pursue as a profession, to prove his disability is no barrier. James Rose is on a unique training placement with Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, where he's fulfilling a long-held ambition, creating and directing his own group of musicians.
Having the opportunity to fulfill that dream with one of the major orchestras is unbelievable others.
One of James's mentors is Roger Preston, who's been a cellist with the BSO for nearly 40 years. He recently became disabled as a result of cancer. While he still plays in the main orchestra, he is also part of the new ensemble.
We don't want to be thought of as, oh, we're successful because we are a disabled ensemble. We want people just to listen to our music making and think, oh, that's really good. Probably most disabled people, even if they could perhaps play a bit, would discount the idea of taking it further. It'd be great to see a few more amateur orchestras incorporating other disabled people, but if disabled people have to form their own ensembles or orchestras as well, great.
The ensemble's professional musicians like Siobhan Clough, who's partially deaf, have all fought hard to get where they are today. They're united in wanting to inspire others.
All through my career I was told that I couldn't be a professional violinist, and it was something I always wanted to do. And now I'm at the Royal Academy of Music and doing exactly what I want to do. So for me, this is just reinforcing the point that it is possible. It just takes perseverance and encouragement.
Ensembles and orchestral situations have been inaccessible, mostly because of the need to be to sight read. This means that I get the opportunity to actually work, as in professionally work, as a musician in a professional setting with other professional musicians.
James says he's always ignored people who've told him he can't do something. He hopes to break what he sees as fixed ideas in professional classical music that have limited him and other disabled musicians in the past.
He's got the drive and determination to do absolutely anything he wants. And he's got the musical talent to do it. I think he'll do extremely well.
Hopefully they'll be playing publicly in the not too distant future as well, so we can hear them.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of James Rose, Resound and the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, which is a truly fantastic example of a music organisation making great change in this space. Now, in my final case study example that I want to share with you, I want to talk about an Australian example, one from a grant funding body. Grant funders are critical in terms of creating pathways for artists to develop their skills and to make and share their work. Back in 2014, the Australian Council for the Arts identified that they had a real problem in attracting disabled artists to their funding programs. While the population percentage here in Australia is 18%, only 1.5% of their grants were coming from disabled people at the time. The reasons were that their grants processes were quite inaccessible, and they didn't at the time have particularly strong relationships with some of the disability communities. So they decided to do something about this, and they introduced a dedicated funding stream specifically designed to support disabled artists. Now, they already had a dedicated funding stream to support First Nations artists, so it was similar in nature, but they used this new stream to test out things around grant program accessibility with the goal of then implementing these across all of their grants programs across the organisation. This involved looking at things like their outreach activity, building relationships with disabled artists and organisations, looking at the accessibility of their pre-application advice, and providing better support to artists to help them make applications. It was about the application process itself being simpler, having more accessible guidelines and application forms, alternative methods of applying, a more accessible grant portal, and even things like an access line in the budget template. It looked at the assessment process and making sure that decisions were being made by disabled artists about who was receiving the funding. So it was a complete end-to-end rethink of the grants life cycle and how we could make this more accessible and welcoming for everyone to feel like grant funding was for them. I'm pleased to say that dedicated disability funding is still being delivered by the Australia Council today, 8 years on. And the even better thing is that they've really taken those accessibility learnings and embedded them across all of their other programs. And in fact, the last time they measured the diversity of their funding programs through that Towards Equity report, their statistics were up to 7%. So not quite 18% of the population, but a lot better than that 1.5% that they started at. So this is a really great step in the right direction in terms of a funding body. So, as you can see from these short case studies, there's a whole range of different ways that people and organisations can make positive change in whatever area of the industry they work in, whether they're a music teacher, a training institution, a music ensemble, or even a funding body. We can all do something to help create a cultural shift and a more inclusive society. Change happens through each of us taking steps at an individual level. As music educators and music therapists, you have essential roles to play in helping develop future generations of disabled people who engage with music, either recreationally or professionally, as artists and as audience members. Pathways do exist for disabled musicians to progress and follow their aspirations into the profession. We need to set the bar high and be able to point people to role models of others who have gone before them. So, because you can't be what you can't see. We also need to know that those accessible pathways are out there so we can help our students and our patients discover them. It's our job to help people see what's possible and also to advocate for change across our industry. So as you attend the rest of this year's conference, I want you to think about what you as an individual can do to help create this cultural shift across the music industry. Leave the conference with an idea of one small new step you can take to help create a positive ripple effect. To finish, I'd love to leave you with a quote from Doug Scarpy, the CEO of the Bournemouth Symphony, who commented on the profound impact their inclusion work has had on their organisation, as I think it really highlights how this sort of positive change actually happens. Doug says, "Putting inclusion at the heart of the orchestra has been transformative. Embracing the small everyday things that over time lead to systemic change has brought us closer to the society which we are here to represent and whose lives we enrich through our music. It has changed the way we look at our company, our art, our audience, and our role in the world." Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed being with you, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.